What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up. We are on step one, and we are looking at the therapeutic value of the steps in terms of their impact on the development of healthy, or what we are calling self-esteem that is grounded in humility. And I think we are about 3 or 4 weeks into the discussion, and we're going to be continuing this for a while, because this becomes really the bedrock of our life, this first step. And so we want to take some time to do that and to really flesh out what's happening here. So tonight I'm going to kind of put this in a context, as I like to do. Then Herb is going to come in and share his thoughts about this. And listen, if you've been to the previous discussions, I walk away very excited from these encounters, from these dialogues we've been having. So I think that it's some very important things that we're talking about. And then Roger will be coming in at the end of the discussion tonight to kind of share his thoughts about step one in self-esteem. We've been talking, last time I mentioned that I saw this step as the beginning of our alignment with reality. We admitted we were powerless. Now, those of you that have suffered from addiction understand the reality and the truth of that. But the admission of that is a challenging thing, because it really starts to shatter our idealized self, that I am in control, I have power. Herb talked about it as our culture is obsessed with self-reliance. You can do anything you set your mind to. That's the defining characteristic of the American ideal, the American culture. Well, I remember Father Martin used to say, if you want to understand how useful willpower is in terms of dealing with alcoholism, he says, try to use willpower when you have diarrhea. It just doesn't work. No matter what you do, if you have to go, you have to go. And he says, if you have any question of what powerlessness is like, just think about that. And I love him. He was a very special man. So in this step, we are beginning to align ourselves with reality. We are learning the importance of an alignment with reality in being able to live a better life. Now, remember, one way of thinking of emotional sobriety is always aiming at the best possible attitude we can have towards ourselves, towards our life, towards reality. Well, this is about having an alignment with the reality of who we are. I love the quote that Roger brought in last time, that living responsibly towards reality is what self-esteem is all about. Well, we can also say that that's what emotional sobriety is about: living responsibly, being able to respond to reality in the best possible way. That's what we're striving for. Well, tonight I want to talk about another thing that has to happen in order to get aligned with reality. We have to surrender what Dr. Theodore Isaac Rubin called our special status. I love that. I love that term. Our special status, that somehow all the rules that apply to other people don't apply to us. We're special. Yeah. I love when Herb gives this talk about when you ignore a physical law, what happens, right? Gravity is gravity just all the time. It doesn't care what you think about it, whether you think it's not happening or not. If you jump off a building and you flap your arms as fast as you can, you're still going to fall and probably break your leg, or worse, die from the fall. Well, it's also true that when we don't live in honor of the reality of who we are, we're jumping off a building all the time. We are at odds with reality, and we keep trying to figure out a way to control something that we don't have any control over. And it's not until we admit that we're powerless that then that paradoxical change takes place. We're able to find a different kind of power that comes out of acceptance, not out of controlling, but out of letting go. Boy, that's something that not many of us have thought about. But now let's put that. So we have to surrender our special status if we're going to become aligned with reality. If I think that somehow the rest of you have to surrender your powerlessness, but I'm going to finally figure out a way to control my drinking. Well, we see what happens when people do that, right? What do we say the outcome of this illness, if it's unchecked, is we die from it. We end up in an institution. We end up in jail. We end up losing everything that's near and dear and important to us. So if we go back to self-esteem, and we're using Dr. Nathaniel Branden's model, the 6 pillars of self-esteem, which we really actually, he said there's 7 pillars. So we're going to start talking about his 7 pillars of self-esteem. And just a reminder of what those are. And then let's look at what's happening in this step in relationship to these pillars. The first was living life consciously. Well, that means seeing life as it is, being aware of what is happening for us. Does this step help us move in that direction? Of course it does. So it's a big yes. That's part of the therapeutic value of this step. We're starting already with step 1 to build a healthier self-esteem, a self-esteem that's aligned with reality, a self-esteem that's based on humility, of accepting ourselves as we are, not as we'd like to be. Now, remember, step 1 also has to do with the unmanageability. So it's really addressing both of those components. The second pillar is self-acceptance. Wow, that is so important in terms of the dynamic that's going on with this. We've been talking about that now for the last several weeks. I'm going to continue the discussion of that tonight, even though some of these other pillars are also being activated with this step. The third is self-assertiveness. Well, I don't see that as relevant to this step. The fourth one, the third one is self-responsibility. Clearly, that's highly relevant to what's going on. We are now taking responsibility for our life. We're taking responsibility for our relationship with what's going on. Very, very important aspect of self-esteem, a very important aspect of emotional sobriety. The fourth one is self-assertiveness. I don't see that being activated much in this step. Living purposefully, neither is that yet. That will come into play later, in my opinion. Our personal integrity, that is number 5. And of course, as we start to deal with and accept ourselves as we are, that is a movement towards more integrity, towards being more whole. Even though I'm admitting a limitation, that's my limitation. That's making me more of who I am. And that's what integrity is about wholeness. And then number 7, I guess I screwed up. So living purposely was number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 6 is living with personal integrity. And number 7 is willingness, right? The willingness to practice these principles, these ideas in our life. Well, this becomes an important thing. And that's what we start to learn. We start to see the power of paradox here. And that by accepting who we are, what we're doing, how we're doing it, then we begin to create the possibility of change. So there's already so much that's being activated. You know, the fires of change are being stoked with step one, is the way I like to think about it. And this is what Dr. Brandon says about acceptance. He goes, to accept is more than simply to acknowledge or admit. So hear that. To accept is more than simply to acknowledge or admit. It is to experience. It is to stand in the presence of the reality. It's to contemplate the reality, to understand what that means for you, to absorb and start to integrate that reality into our consciousness. You've seen Herb do this a million times. He talks about, it's not about here, it's about here. You have a lot of information, but no transformation. That's what acceptance is. It's moving things from here to here. It's an experience of who we are and what we are. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Herb and we'll have his comments, and then Roger. So where are you, my friend? I need to.
I'm definitely here.
I know you are, but I have to get out of here.
Mhm.
How do I remove my spotlight so I can find you? All right.
I think Tom Potash is also here, if you want to.
All right. Well, Tom can take over this function, but say something again, Herb, so I can identify.
I'm here. Yes, definitely.
There you are. Gotcha.
My screen.
All right. Tag, you're it.
Thank you very much, Alan. Yeah, and you also gave me a new perspective for how we're approaching this, which is applying each of the steps to all of the pillars. And so that helped me a lot, because I hadn't broadened my lens sufficiently to incorporate that. You spent some time with admit, which is in fact the word in step one, admit to our innermost self. And yet Bill in the big book has a much more profound, in the way that you were suggesting it, much different than just admit or accept. He has a much different word, and I think it's there is a solution. On page 30, he says, we need to concede to our innermost self that we are not like other people. Concede is very much along the lines that you were talking about, to our innermost self, much deeper than just admit. And that is about becoming conscious. My process is so exemplifies what you elaborated there, in that I'm age 43, I'm going to support my wife's recovery in a hospital program. They asked me to look at my drinking. I thought that's just part of the drill for supporting hers, and I'll talk about my history. And for the very first time, age 43, with a graduate education in psychology and lots of therapy and human development, I did this autobiography of my relationship with alcohol. And I began to see, as a historical bullet point, from age 12 to age 43, 30 years of periodic loss of control, to the extent that it was very visible. We're talking about jails overnight and hospitals and lots of embarrassment, without the details tonight, but I could see them, and it began to shape the puzzle piece as the beginning of the information that I needed. But when I read it out to a public group in that hospital, as they had asked me to, it just washed over me as an experience. So my information that I got from writing it out began the process, but nothing happened to me until I read it out, and I had an experience, a profound experience, that I have a drinking problem. I wasn't embarrassed that I was a drinking problem. I was embarrassed that I had never seen it. So consciousness is so, like, the first pillar is so incredibly important, to have that, not just knowledge, as you indicated, but the experience that goes hand in glove with changing then us at a radical level. And it was looking at that suffering. The suffering is what disturbs us, which is the word he uses in step 10. You talked about suffering is not such a bad thing. It's a good thing, because it's a signal to us that something's amiss. And so then we can course correct. In connection with step 1, and you made the emphasis on unmanageability, what it really gives you also is this sense, not just of addiction, because there may be people here that aren't in addiction, or it's not the issue, but unmanageability is really the issue, where I could see that although I have very strong willpower, my willpower wasn't strong enough, certainly to deal with my addiction, but it wasn't even strong enough to deal with my life. I did what I didn't want to do, and I didn't do what I wanted to do. My willpower was ineffective, and I became progressively, over a long period of time, consciously aware of the ineffectiveness of my willpower and my effort to create the life that I wanted, and that I really did need help. Step 1, and Roger made it so clear in the original presentation about humility. Humility is just the realization of the truth. And the truth was that on my own, I'm ineffective with regard to my addiction, but also with regard to managing my life in an effective way, where I'm producing a life that flourishes. I was not. I was restless, irritable, and discontented as a way of life, as a state of being. And it was admitting that was the humiliation that brought me to humility, that sense of complete defeat. And then, Alan, you made a wonderful comment about integrity, and I connected it to Bill's suggestion in how it works, that it's about rigorous honesty. Now, I was able to do honesty in the beginning. Over time, it became more rigorous, but that's because I had accountability. Again, bringing in that humility. I really need help, and it's, in this case, it's human help. I needed a sounding board for transparency, and the combination of these kinds of things over a long period of time was transformational. So that's my experience with it.
Thank you so much, Herb. All right, let me grab Roger and remove. All
Herb,
right.
you are one eloquent son of a gun, man. I gotta tell you, I love how you express yourself so much.
As
Thank you.
my wife, Mary Catherine Bridget Flanagan, said, Herb, you kissed the Blarney Stone.
That's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it as well. Thank you, both Alan and Herb, for that. Gosh, I had some comments prepared, but you guys have stimulated a whole bunch of other connections and associations here. So I'll stumble along as best I can here. I will start. Alan, you had mentioned the importance of acceptance, because clearly that's a big part of what step 1 is about. It's about alignment with reality, as you mentioned, Alan, and it's about acceptance as part of that alignment. It's about acceptance of reality. And as I've heard you mention numerous times before, Alan, that one of the paradoxes that's implicit, at least in step 1, is in admitting powerlessness. Admitting powerlessness allows those struggling with alcoholism and drug addiction to move to a more empowered position, not in terms of self with a capital S or ego with a capital E, but in terms of subservience to reality, serving reality as best we understand it, serving truth as best we understand it. Not easy to understand it. You know, we all have blinders. We all have blind spots. We all have, you know, what I will call in this moment characterological distortions, right, of reality. Our ego needs see to that, right, and our defenses see to that. Reality can be an incredibly challenging and difficult thing to discern. But as we become more humble and as we recognize that, I think we become more able to see more and more of reality as we go. In a chapter 4 of his book, How to Raise Your Self-Esteem, called Learning Self-Acceptance, Nathaniel Branden wrote, if the essence of living consciously that Alan just referred to is respect for facts and reality, then self-acceptance is its ultimate test. Now, why is that? When the facts we must face have to do with ourselves, living consciously can suddenly become very difficult. Here is where the challenge of self-acceptance enters. Self-acceptance asks that we approach our experience with an attitude that makes the concepts of approval or disapproval irrelevant. Instead, the desire is to see, to know, to be aware. I'll say that again. The desire is to see what's going on with us, what our consciousness is about, what our defenses are about, what our patterns are about, to see, to know, and to be aware. Now, to be self-accepting does not mean to be without a desire to change, improve, or evolve. The truth is that self-acceptance is a precondition of change. Now, that's often a very confusing idea. In a form of therapy called Gestalt psychotherapy, there's an idea called the paradoxical theory or the paradoxical rule of change, which is in order to change, we need to more deeply become aware of and more deeply embrace the truth of our existing pattern, the truth of what we are doing. Because as we take more ownership of what we are doing, this kind of mysterious process happens within us where we actually become more amenable to movement, more amenable to growth. The examples are countless. If I'm in denial of the pain I'm in, hard for me to do much about the pain I'm in because I won't express it. If I'm ashamed of it, humiliated by it, if I judge it, again, I won't go near it. I won't accept it. So it stays frozen inside of me. It stays intractable. If I start to talk about the pain I'm in, if I start to let the tears come, then things begin to move. My process begins to open up. And as that happens, change will happen. So the truth is, as Nathaniel Branden put it, the truth is that self-acceptance is a precondition to change. Well, nothing is a better example of that than step 1. In admitting powerlessness, the door to change becomes open. In 35 or almost 40 years now of working primarily with people in recovery, the level of growth and change and their level of self-esteem through work in the 12 steps has been astonishing to me, absolutely astonishing. The ability to look at oneself more honestly and to make knowing what's true the goal rather than making myself look good, right? Making what's real the goal. All of a sudden, if knowing reality is where my allegiance lies, if serving reality is where my allegiance lies, all of a sudden, a lot of ideas that stop us about humiliation and shame and embarrassment, they become greatly reduced as obstacles because they're not the point anymore. The point is what's true. And even if it makes me uncomfortable, even if it makes me embarrassed, even if it makes me ashamed, that has tremendous power to help me through those feelings to stay focused on what's the truth. That's the most important thing. Branden went on to say, if we accept the fact that what we feel and what we are at any given moment of our existence, we can permit ourselves to be fully aware of the nature of our choices and actions, and our development is no longer blocked. I'll say that again. I misquoted one word. If we accept the fact of what we feel and the fact of what we are at any given moment of our existence, then we can begin to be aware. We can begin to give ourselves choices and options. So in terms of step one and its connection to self-esteem, from my perspective, step one lays the foundation and opens the door, because it becomes an entry point to truth, as Alan was talking about, an entry point to reality, and everything else, sobriety, self-esteem, emotional sobriety, can be built from that foundation. Until that foundation is created, nothing solid can be built. So thank you. I appreciate the time, you guys.
Well, that's interesting, Roger, because Bill talks about a spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. And the implications is that the foundation of the arch, the foundation is step one, that surrender, that complete defeat. Yeah. And the words, I'd never heard a phrase, respect reality. That was wonderful. I just love that phrase.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
To see, to know, and to be aware of. Wow. That's what we're talking about, right? Is how do we stoke that flame, right? How do we, encourage the development of that? And that's what we're doing here. So once again, you guys, wonderful discussion. Tom is with us now. Tom, can you join us in the spotlight, or do I need to add it on you?
There I am.
There's Tom. And I was going to add Tom Potash too. Let's get him in here.
Oh, were you trying to get him and you got me instead?
Listen, there's always room for you.
Yeah, you don't want to get the wrong Tom though, man. That's a problem.
We got two Toms and they're both wonderful. All right, Tom. Sure. This is the opener. Unless you want to say something tonight, Tom. I know you asked.
No. I'm just glad to be. I'm glad to be back. I love what you guys are doing, and I was just sitting there taking notes and reading looking through my Honoring the Self book that Roger had recommended of Dr. Brandon's, and I'm just listening and studying tonight. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be back to the group.
Good to see you, man. I love you.
Love you too.
Well, I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps, that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved. The forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. The first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. We're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step two comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.